President Trump's foreign policy has clearly taken a radically different course to his predecessors, outlining of his rhetoric, of how he views the world through a transactional lens, his pay-as-you-play rules, but also in the national security strategy that sees the Western Hemisphere, the whole of America and Latin America too, as a priority, invoking the Monroe Doctrine, stopping foreign interference in Latin America, as has been well documented, decrying Europe's decline, wanting the Ukrainian war brought to an expeditious end and wanting Russia back in from the cold. The Financial Times refers to this year as the decline of diplomacy, the age of the special envoy in Trump's America. It's a good time to hear from a lifelong US foreign policy official who's had senior roles in every Republican administration, from Reagan through to Trump. John Bolton, former national security advisor to President Trump. In his book, The Room Where It Happened, the White House memoir, details an insider account and critique of Trump's foreign policy style. First time around, how he felt his old boss prioritised personal loyalty over national security, describing the decision-making as follows. It was like making and executing policy inside a pinball machine, not the West Wing of the White House. John is now facing criminal charges over alleged willful mishandling of classified information, an 18-count federal indictment, charges he denies, and the timing of it analysts see as widely seen as fitting a broader pattern of Trump seeking vengeance against political enemies. The White House says it's about accountability, that transmitting top-secret information is a crime. John joins us on the programme tonight. Good to see you again, John. Welcome to France 24. Thank you for speaking to me.
I want to be with you. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, John. I want to get your thoughts on the state of the world right now as 2025 comes to an end. But first, briefly ask you about your case as you prepare your defence. When's it scheduled to go to court and how's it going?
Well, it's in court now. We don't know when the trial will be. I really can't comment on the specifics of it, as you might understand, but I do expect to be vindicated.
Let's turn to Ukraine. John, the shape-shifting Trump peace plan, President Zelensky appearing under more pressure than at any time since the start of the conflict, pressure to give up territory, to call elections. Where do you see this going?
I'm worried about the current state of affairs. I think it's a mistake for Ukraine to make concessions at this point. I don't think Donald Trump is really motivated by U.S. national security interest or the issues for NATO or Ukrainian interest. I think he wants the Nobel Peace Prize. I think it's been on his mind since the first term. He knows Barack Obama got one and didn't deserve it, which I think a lot of Americans agree with. But that's not a reason to give Trump a Nobel Peace Prize when he doesn't deserve it either. The fact is here that the Russians are hoping that the war of attrition they've been waging against Ukraine after starting with unprovoked aggression in 2022, that the war of attrition will cause Ukraine to crack sometime in the spring or summer. And I don't think that's necessarily right, but that's what I think is on Putin's mind. He thinks time is on his side. This is not the time for the U.S. or Europe really to give up and say, let's cut the best deal we can. I think that's a big mistake.
But there are kind of two things eating at each other right now, aren't there, John? You have this, something's got to give at some stage. You've touched upon it. On Russia, there's this significant push-pull now. Europe has sanctions on the Kremlin, saying it is increasingly starving the Putin machine. That is the way forward. But in light of this recent US national security strategy, US focus, it is now largely counter to that. Their argument that Russia should be brought in the cold. And I just wonder whether you think sanctions have been working on Russia, John, enough to change the shape of the war?
No, I don't think they have been. I think both the Biden administration and the European Union made critical mistakes when they imposed sanctions on Russia's exports of oil right at the beginning. They wanted to have the best of both worlds. They wanted to impose cost on Russia, but not raise the price of gasoline at the pump in Europe or the United States. And that effort to achieve two relatively contradictory goals has enabled the Kremlin to skate through this. They're selling their oil, they're financing the war. They're not getting the global market price, but they've got plenty of oil. They'll in the Kremlin's view, I think they'll get through this somehow. The way to put pressure on Russia is to say simply, we don't accept any Russian exports of oil. If that raises our gasoline prices a little bit, then let's increase production. Let's increase U.S. production, get the Gulf Arabs to increase more. That'll keep the prices down. We need to squeeze Russia harder, not let up the pressure at this point.
When you look at the ongoing debate about using Russia's frozen assets from Brussels, and you see the Belgian Prime Minister Bart de Wever deeply worried, saying that it's against his view because of the legal impact. We're seeing Russia saying threatening legal action on the Belgian bank as well. Euroclear. I spoke last week to the British Chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee, Emily Thornberry, who said, do it. It has to be big moments because these are the moments that scare Vladimir Putin. What would you do on this issue?
Well, I don't have any objection to using frozen Russian assets as security for loans that the EU is contemplating. I just like some assurance that the U.S. isn't getting itself into a difficult position by doing this. We have a lot of assets overseas that our adversaries could freeze at some point as well. But in principle, I would say go ahead and do it. My understanding is a late development that the government of Italy has now come out in support of Belgium. We'll see if that plays out. But I think that would throw a real wrench into any EU efforts to achieve consensus on what to do. And the needs in Ukraine are very real. There's no doubt about it.
You will have seen over decades plenty of national security strategies. Were you surprised, John, how different this is? And if so, what surprised you the most?
Well, I think it's a reflection of what the Trump administration has done. I don't think there's really anything substantively new in it. I think there's some unhelpful rhetoric about civilizational erasure in Europe. Look, I'm not a fan of the European Union. I've said many times it's less than the sum of its parts, but there it is, and it's still an ally. Its member states are still allies of the United States. I think the real problem here is that Trump doesn't have his own strategy. I don't like this document, but I rest more comfortably knowing Donald Trump has probably never read it, never will read it, and won't follow it anyway.
Are there some within that excoriating review of Europe? Are there some home truths that you think are within there? I'm minded on immigration. There are elements to which he's compared to the far right, but there are also elements to which we're hearing similar conversations. For example, in Germany, France, and the UK, Prime Minister, the Home Secretary, and Muslim Home Secretary saying that immigration is, quote, tearing the UK apart.
Look, I think the West as a whole has not had effective immigration policies consistently. From the U.S. perspective, I think we benefit from immigration. We benefit from legal immigration. We, the sovereign people of the United States, control who gets in. That the would-be immigrants don't get to make that decision. But on the whole, I think from the U.S. perspective, our history has been we are stronger because of immigration. I think the European Union just hasn't thought through its policy carefully enough. And despite all the talk about union, it's been individual governments within the EU that helped prompt the wave of illegal immigration that's come in. So I don't doubt Europe has things it needs to do and decisions it's made that I don't agree with. That doesn't make them any less allies of the United States. It just makes them more problematic.
John, the Financial Times had a very perhaps prescient headline in the past few weeks, talking about the decline of diplomacy, the age of the envoy of the Trump America, saying Steve Witkoff, Jared Kushner, the impact that they're having on diplomacy worldwide. Trump calls Witkoff, quote, the new Henry Kissinger, who leaks less. Has it been a game changer on US foreign policy, and for better or worse?
Well, I think the chief attribute of Witkoff and many of these other envoys is total loyalty to Donald Trump. They don't know much about what they're doing. And I think in the case of Ukraine, I think Putin has played both Witkoff and Trump very effectively from the Kremlin's point of view. That is unfortunate. And it used to be that knowing something about the subject matter you were discussing was considered a plus, not in the Trump administration. That will come back to haunt us, I'm afraid.
L.P. Hartley, the author, talks about the past being a different country. They do things differently there. But if we do go back to the first term, and I talk about Venezuela, John, I want to try and get a sense of whether it's just something apropos of nothing recent. How much was Venezuela dominating the thoughts of Trump the first time round?
Well, Well, overthrowing Maduro didn't dominate his thoughts enough. I certainly believed strongly back then that we should work with the Venezuelan opposition to overthrow the Maduro government. I think there are very important U.S. national security interests at stake then and today, not just the benefit of the Venezuelan people, although they would benefit substantially if Maduro were overthrown. Venezuela is an effective base of operations for Russia, which considers it much safer from their point of view than Cuba, which is only 90 miles away from Florida. The Cubans themselves regard keeping Maduro in power as a backstop for their regime. They worry if Maduro fell, the post-Castro regime in Cuba would be in danger. I think they're right on that. That's a reason to overthrow Maduro, in my view. The Chinese presence in Venezuela is much more substantial than it was 6 years ago, and Iran has a very substantial presence to launder their sanctioned oil revenues through Venezuela and as a base for Hezbollah's operations in the Western Hemisphere. So I think overthrowing Maduro is in the U.S. national interest. I just wish this time I could have some confidence Trump has a plan and is not operating by the seat of his pants. But if this time the Maduro regime is overthrown, I think it would be good for Venezuela, good for the hemisphere, good for the United States.
I don't know if you know Doug Farrar, John. He's a US analyst on Venezuela. He was on the programme recently talking about how he helped the Pentagon in its wargaming in 2019. Went through several strategies. Each time the wargaming was on overthrowing Maduro. And he said each time it led to chaos. There were factions of gangs of ex-security forces. The idea is that you take out a key port, the airports, and even in that scenario, he said there was still chaos. Does that... I wonder two things. One, would that still be a goer for you on that knowledge? And two, does the Trump administration take wargaming seriously?
Well, I don't know when those war games took place. I was certainly not aware of them when I was in the administration. But I would emphasize in 2018 and 2019, we worked very closely with the Venezuelan opposition because if we succeeded in overthrowing Maduro, they would have the responsibility to set up the successor government. And if we failed, they would bear the brunt of the reprisal, as they sadly did back then. I am not confident this time that the White House is working closely with the opposition. The opposition says it supports what Trump's doing. They don't have any option publicly. But whether or not we really are working and thinking, as we did very hard back in the first term, about what we called the day after, what happens after Maduro's overthrown, it could be real trouble. We had some pretty good concrete plans, I think, that our economic team had put together to be ready to govern in Venezuela afterwards, and the opposition knew that and was working with us. If it's not happening this time, that's a danger. I don't think it was a danger 6 years ago, though.
What are your thoughts looking, John? This is something you must do every year for many years. On the next year, when we look at 2026, and we haven't mentioned China at this point or Taiwan and its intentions, what worries you? What perhaps the opposite? What makes you kind of relieved looking at the future? I mean, we're in this chaotic world that we're in with multiple wars. What are some of your thoughts ahead of 2026?
Well, the biggest threat that the U.S. and the West as a whole faces for the rest of the century is China, as they try to expand their hegemonic influence along their Indo-Pacific periphery, building an axis with Russia, what Xi Jinping and Putin have called a partnership without limits. I think the main event next year is going to be Donald Trump's visit to China in April is when it's planned. I think he hopes to by then to have negotiated what he called in his first term the biggest trade deal in history. I think it's a very dangerous period because he wants this trade deal so much that he's doing things that worry Taiwan, worry Japan, worry others, that he's prepared to give up more than he should to get that trade deal. I think on the other hand, there's growing support in the United States for a strong policy against China. I think we've just seen a survey that says Trump's base and the country as a whole believe in significant increases in the defense budget. And I think support in Congress for a strong American posture in the world remains. I think that is the best guarantee, along with our alliances for peace and security next year and for the foreseeable future.
I just want to round up on Europe, John. You said some interesting things tonight, particularly your thoughts on the EU, similarly in line with the national security strategy on that. Are there leaders, despite your thoughts on the EU as an institution, around Europe this year? A few of them are having an annus horribilis, including President Macron and Keir Starmer, low popularity ratings. Are there any European leaders right now that particularly impress you?
Well, I think Giorgia Meloni in Italy has turned out to be a strong leader. I think she's certainly impressed Trump, and I'm impressed by the job that Mark Rutte is doing as Secretary General of NATO. I think in some of the key countries, Germany, France, and the UK, as you've indicated, you've got leaders who are in political trouble, and that makes it difficult for them to exert a strong influence because of their own domestic turmoil. And until that changes, I don't see the EU specifically providing the kind of strong leadership that would be important at a time when, in the Trump administration, these flashes of isolationism appear.
To go back to where we started as a final question, John, on Ukraine, you talked about Russia and the implications of trying to starve out Russia of its resources, but the issues with oil are clearly allowing it to continue. And Ukraine's existential issue, needing that money, needing money to keep it going into next year. Let me ask you about Volodymyr Zelensky, the president, under pressure for elections in a time of war. Is that a good idea?
I don't think so. I think Ukraine, as Great Britain during World War II, has a very good argument. You can't have elections in wartime, especially in Ukraine's case, when you've got the foreign invader occupying 20% of the country. If you're going to be fair about this, you'd have free and fair elections in Russia, too. We know that's not going to happen. So I think Ukraine needs to do more to show the fight against corruption continues. You can probably have local elections in places where the Russians aren't occupying. And I think this is advice from a friend. I think they need to lower their draft age from 25 to 18 to get more manpower on the battlefield and to make sure that the country as a whole is bearing the burden of this war equally.
John, thank you so much for your time tonight. Have a good Christmas period. All the best for 2026. Thank you. John Bolton, former National Security Advisor to President Trump.